Oh well, come in, sisters. Take a seat. On our historical celebration today, we look at 806 years ago, on the 1st of June, 1215. This guy, called Temujin, also known as Genghis Khan, was planning of conquering all of China. He chose the easiest and the weakest entry point, which was western Jia. Jia had been vassalized by the much more powerful Jin for decades, but their relationship with their masters deteriorated over time to the point that when Jia saw Genghis Khan knocking on their door and went asking the Jin dynasty for help, this genius of a Jin emperor, Jing Sheng, answered with, "It is to our advantage when our enemies attack each other. Wherein lies the danger to us?" he was asking. Well, the danger to the Jin dynasty lied in the fact that Western Jia capitulated in less than a couple of years, and then Genghis Khan turned his gaze towards the Jin, and in less than 3 years after that, the Jin dynasty lost nearly 70% of its territory. That's what happens, my man. And also eventually, given 20 more years, the entirety of China would have been taken over by the Mongols. Now, what we look at today, instead of looking at conquerors and Mongols, we're looking at the DPS. Because there is a difference when you're looking at what to play as a tank and what to play as a healer, and what you want to look at in a DPS. Because you decide to spice things up in your life and to play a tank, right? You play a tank, you have 6 options, you have to choose one. Whichever you choose, you're going to be doing the same thing. You go for a healer, the answer is the same. There is 6 of them, you're gonna pick one, and then you're gonna heal. Maybe there is a slight variation, right? Because Discipline and Holy Paladin can also do some damage, and it doesn't work quite the same to the other healers, but in the end, we are talking about the same thing. But when you look for a DPS, there is a difference. The difference is that you can be very close to the bad guy, or you can be very far away to the bad guy. This distinction is called being a ranged DPS or being a melee DPS. This is a very big and very important distinction, which can crucially change the way you play and also the way in which you want to do content. So the obvious question is, why would you want to choose to play a melee DPS, and why would you want to choose to play a ranged DPS? What would push you towards playing either? Now, let me just point out the obvious here, the answer that people are going to give right as this question is being asked, which is, duh, Blizzard hates melee. Why would you want to play melee? You should play a ranged DPS. You're not gonna find spots if you play a melee DPS. It's literally impossible to find a spot as a melee DPS. Okay, let's clear the area around this subject. Okay, let's dissipate the fog and the mist around this and point out what's happening. What's happening is that, yes, you are correct. If you want the TLDR, and if you want this video to end in 30 seconds, the answer is whatever you want to do, just start playing ranged DPS, because you're just going to have more chances at playing the game, because they are more popular. This answer could also work for tanks. Instead of being ranged and melee DPS, you could just answer, just play Vengeance. Why would you play Protection Warrior? Same for healers, just play Shaman or Paladin. Why would you play Mistweaver Monk? And yet, there are still Mistweaver Monks in Mythic raids, there are still Protection Warriors in Mythic raids, there are still Protection Warriors clearing plus 21 keys, and Mistweaver Monks doing the same. So you can still play, it's just gonna be harder. Not impossible, not a super difficult task, it's just gonna be harder. The point when it comes to the play rates of melee and ranged DPS, when you look at raids, it looks like this. As you can see, the bottom half of the representation in raid is covered in melee DPS. What's even worse is that the ranged DPS specs that are in there are ranged DPS specs that have a much more popular counterpart. So Demonology and Destruction and Frost are there. That's because people are playing Affliction and Fire. As a matter of fact, there are more Fire Mage players than there are Windwalker, Assassination, Retribution, Feral, Survival, and Sub-Rogues combined. So, of course, when it comes to raids, ranged DPS are more popular, they are more requested. When you look at a composition, you are generally going to find something like 14 DPS are needed for the raid. You're gonna have 4 healers and 2 tanks. This leaves out 14 spots. Generally, you will be seeing something like 9 ranged and 5 melee players is okay, sometimes even 8 and 6. That's generally the composition you're going to be seeing. The reason why this is somewhat problematic is, of course, because, and this is something we have gone over in our lessons many times, the fact that most tanks are Brewmaster and Vengeance means you need Warrior for the shout. You're also going to need very often just a couple, maybe a couple of DKs, so they can get you some anti-magic zone. That's already 3 slots more or less being taken by buffs and debuffs that you have to bring. Sometimes there's not going to be a Brewmaster tank, which means you will want a Windwalker for the debuff. Sometimes there is no Vengeance tank, which means you need a Havoc. Or many times you want a Havoc anyways because you want to split the raid. You're hitting different targets. You want to have the Demon Hunter debuff spread more easily. So if you only want to have 5 or so spots in raids for melee, it starts to get kind of crowded. If you take away the spot for the DKs, you take away the spot for the Warrior, maybe one for a Demon Hunter, you only have a couple of spots left. And you have to squish in Subtlety, Survival, Feral, Enhancement, Outlaw or Assassination, so it gets kind of crowded. On the other hand, of course, if you're a ranged DPS, you're just chilling. You have Balance Druid, you have Mage, you can just go Fire. When you play Mage, you have Warlock, and you can just go Affliction. You even have Shadow and Elemental. So in the hybrid category, this expansion ranged DPS have hit the jackpot, because their hybrids, Shadow Priest, Elemental, and Balance are all popular right now. Whereas when you look at the hybrids of melee, you have Feral, you have Enhancement, you have Retribution, and they are all in the bottom half. Technically, the only one that escapes this hybrid badness for melee is Windwalker, just by a little bit, for raid encounters. When it comes to Mythic Plus, it is definitely more varied. You have definitely way more chances of being taken, because buffs and debuffs are not as important anymore. You're not going to be excluded from a party because you definitely do want Rallying Cry and Battle Shout, so you absolutely need a Warrior in the Mythic Plus key, or you absolutely want a Windwalker Monk for the physical damage debuff in your key. So you open up more options. Of course, if you just point out and look at the absolute top keys, they're all gonna look like this. It's just gonna be Mage and Balanced Druid and eventually Elemental Shaman, and the melee DPS is mostly gonna be a Rogue, sometimes a Windwalker Monk. But these are people that you can count in the hundreds that do Mythic Plus at this level. If you go down, if you go down dozens of thousands of logs down, 80,000, 90,000, 100,000 logs down in keys in the 19 and 20 level, which is the level that is going to be crucial in the next tier in 9.1, because clearing the plus 20 is what is going to give you the teleport, the new reward, so to speak, in Mythic Plus. When you look at these keys, it gets a little bit more varied, right? Look at this. Look at all these colors. You see the Windwalker Monk, you see the DKs, you have Warriors, you have Rogues, there are still Demon Hunters in there. You can move over, you have a Red Paladin in here, Windwalkers are still there, Rogues are still there, Havoc, Demon Hunters and Warriors are still there. You see? The colors get more bright, they get more varied, more different and diverse. There are definitely more options if you're planning to go into Mythic Plus when it comes to melee DPS. So at the very least, from the balance perspective, when you have to choose if you want to play a melee DPS or a range DPS, the advantage of the range DPS is in the 65% to 35%. That is the average split. Okay. In lower Mythic Plus keys, it gets closer to 60-40. In higher Mythic Plus keys, closer to 70-30. That's your average chances when you are thinking about playing one of the two sub-roles, melee or ranged. Now, it might surprise you, it might shock you, but meta and being strong isn't just the only thing people look for when choosing a spec. Sometimes people maybe are perfectly aware that range DPS is more popular, that range DPS is stronger. They don't need to be told. Sometimes they simply don't enjoy it. Sometimes there are many people that I know myself who simply do not enjoy, for example, casting. They don't enjoy the idea of having to stand still and just watch a bar fill up until their spell can be cast. They want to be close to the boss, they want to auto-attack and just use their ability instantly. A lot of times that's one of the driving points for melee DPS. Maybe, possibly, one of the reasons why Hunter is by far the most popular range DPS spec, because it allows you basically to do what a melee DPS does, but at range, which is almost always cast instant abilities and be very, very mobile, not be rooted in place when you want to cast stuff, with just very, very few exceptions like aim shot. And that might be one of the reasons, simply the preference of the movement and the preference of the flow of combat. instant abilities give you a better flow. And you might be surprised by how much this can affect people. I remember initially getting pretty thrown off trying to play Elemental Shaman when you're playing with Ice Fury. Because, for example, Elemental Shaman is a ranged DPS, you are historically hard casting abilities, but then you have periods where you are casting Flame Shock, which is instant, Earth Shock, which is instant, Earthquake is instant as well. You have instant lava bursts from your passive procs, you have instant frost shocks when you're playing with Ice Fury, and there can be some windows where you go like 10-15 seconds just casting instant abilities. You're like a melee DPS except you're 30 yards away from the boss, and your abilities do not have the same impact. They don't feel the same as a melee hit when you're casting those instant abilities with these caster animations. And these can be pretty important things to give people the feel that they are enjoying the spec, they are enjoying the way it plays. So outside of the meta, outside the preference of how do you move during an encounter and during a fight, as well as how do you go through your rotation, how does it flow between people who enjoy casting and people who enjoy instant abilities, there is a big question that people often fight over, which is what is harder, what is more complicated, whether or not it's the more complicated rotation or whether or not it's the more complicated setting that Blizzard puts you in, i.e. the mechanics you have to do in the encounter, in the Mythic Plus key. Now this expansion we have seen a rise of complaints related to melee DPS getting shafted by affixes in Mythic Plus. We have gotten Storming this expansion and we have gotten Spiteful this expansion, which are all particularly focused on making the lives of melee DPS harder. Storming is quite a bit more intrusive and annoying to deal with than Volcanic. And then of course, let's not go over Spiteful, that's just very bad for melee DPS. Then you also have other mechanics like Cleave, Frontal Smashes, Circular Smashes around the targets. You have the slightly higher annoyances of things like Quaking, which are more annoying for melee DPS. You also have Sanguine, which is more annoying for melee DPS. Whirlwinds, AoEs, all centered around melee. They very rarely happen in range. In range, what you will be usually hit by is just single target abilities, single target casts, like throw spear, throw javelin, throw shadow bolts or firebolts by the enemies that you have to interrupt. Whereas for melee, you have to actively dodge things that cannot be interrupted, cannot be stunned, you just have to properly get away. So when you're choosing to play a melee DPS, you know you are setting yourself up when it comes to avoiding mechanics, when it comes to Mythic Plus. This is certain, it's guaranteed. It's also one of the reasons why range DPS is more favored in Mythic Plus. It's certainly not the reason. There are still other things more important, like the damage profile of a range DPS in a Mythic Plus key, but certainly this amount of mechanics being put on the melee in Mythic Plus doesn't help the role. When it comes to raids, it's a little bit more of a handshake. In raids, there are multiple mechanics that ranged have to do that melee don't really have to, and then mechanics that melee have to do that range don't really have to. The reason why melee DPS are usually more annoyed by the mechanics in raids isn't because they are harder, but because they make them stop DPS. Think about the pull-in, the suck-in of Hungering Destroyer. That's not particularly hard on either of the roles, melee or ranged, but it just makes melee DPS have to stop doing damage, whereas ranged can continue. Think about the huge AoE of Sludge Fist, where all the melee have to run away. Ranged DPS can just keep doing damage. Doesn't really interrupt them too much. Think about the winds in Stone Legion. When you get pulled away as a melee, you just stop doing damage. If you get pulled away as a ranged, you can keep casting instant abilities or maybe casting on the move. You're not losing as much DPS. The lots of movements, running around, getting knocked back, having to run to soak required on the Nathrius. All of that can happen as a ranged DPS while you still do damage, whereas a melee has to stop and be interrupted. This is one of the reasons why one of the big complaints, or rather one of the big asks of melee DPS is that melee DPS should have higher damage than a ranged DPS, because you have to account for all of the mechanic that stop a melee DPS from being able to do damage. So if you give melee DPS 110 damage and you give ranged 100 damage, because melee DPS lose 10% of their time from doing mechanics, so 10% of their damage, that 110 is going to back down to 99 and basically very similar to the ranged DPS. But if you put them both at 100 damage, because a melee DPS has to move more, has to dodge mechanics more, it eventually is going to lose on damage. That's one of the big complaints as a melee DPS. Unfortunately, it is a very, very difficult problem to solve because you think what I just said made sense. You think this would balance things out. But what happens in every single fight, in every single encounter where the melee don't have to move? We just gave them 110 damage over the range DPS is 100, on the premise accounting for the fact that they have to move. What happens for all of those phases where there is no movement? Then this means that the melee DPS are just out-damaging the range DPS. So if the melee DPS, even after accounting for their movement, they are still doing the same damage of a range DPS, then why would you bring a range DPS? The melee DPS are going to be doing the same damage as them when they move, and 10% more damage when they don't have to move. So, TLDR, they would always be doing more damage than a ranged. That is why it's a complicated matter to solve. You can't just buff their damage up like that. So I'm not gonna get into the possible theories onto how to solve this issue, but unfortunately it is something that exists right now. In this state, it is something that is favoring range DPS, whenever there is some movement involved. So at this point, after having listened to this for about 20 minutes, one might ask me, one of my students might ask me, but Mr. Professor, I have listened to you, and from what I can understand, you're telling me that range DPS do more damage because Blizzard balanced them in a way that even on a target dummy, a Fire Mage or an Elemental Shaman or a Shadow Priest or an Affliction Warlock is going to out-damage a Red Paladin or out-damage a Windwalker Monk. That is just on a blank, stationary target dummy, and they are already doing more damage. And then they do even more damage because melee have to move more, have to dodge more mechanics, meaning losing DPS uptime. And then you're telling me that naturally range DPS are going to be more requested in Mythic Plus. They're going to be more requested in raids at a rate of 65 to 35% split, more or less. You're also telling me that melee DPS are more susceptible to buffs and debuffs being required in the raid because Monk debuff is a melee thing, Demon Hunter debuff is a melee thing, Warrior Shout is a melee thing, Anti-Magic Zone is a melee thing, and for Mythic Plus, even something like Shroud is a melee thing. So many of these must-have are going to be embedded on a melee spec, which further isolates, further limits the amount of specs you can choose as a melee, whereas you have more freedom as a ranged. Now, if I am told all of this, the obvious question I would have to ask, Your Excellency, is then why would you want to play a melee DPS? If this entire video is about looking at both roles, both sides of the same role in choosing to play one of them, then where are the good points for melee? Because so far this has been a depressing journey, just listing the amount of deficits and the merits and disadvantages that melee DPS players have to go through. Well, the answer, I'm sorry if it's going to be a cheap one, if it's going to be a cliche, I'm sorry guys, but the answer is that this is a video game and you play what you enjoy. Yes, congratulations, you have been able to discover that range DPS have an advantage in this game. At the end of the day, if I had to choose between playing Windwalker Monk or playing Marksmanship Hunter, I would rather cut my arm off before I started playing Marksmanship Hunter in a Mythic Raid guild. That is just not going to happen. I don't enjoy it. It's boring, I don't care how many more advantages I would get if I was arranged. I just enjoy Windwalker more and I would play Windwalker. That is the reason why melee DPS are still played and popular. Even if I say that there is a 65-35 split or a 60-40 split in the lower levels, so to speak. You know, in Mythic Plus we are still talking about 2.7 million range DPS players and 2.3 or 2.2 million melee DPS players. You know, maybe that helps you putting the numbers in a little bit more of a perspective. There are still tons of them. And it's not that they're all dumb. It's not that they all don't know and they need to be told about this tinfoil hat secret. You know, they haven't realized yet that they would have gotten a higher chance of playing this game if they were just playing a mage. I'm sure they understand, okay? I'm sure melee players are very well aware that if they stopped playing Enhancement Shaman and went playing Elemental, they would have a better chance of playing this game. That is something they are well aware of. I am going to go on a limb here and say that they enjoy playing Enhancement more than they enjoy playing Elemental, and that's why they're playing it. You know, and in case you think this is just some cheap talk that is coming from someone playing a Restoration Shaman, which is meta, or even Elemental Shaman, which is meta as well at this point. So you are like, well, it's easy to say just play what you enjoy. If I enjoy playing Feral Druid, and despite being 227 item level with 1900 Raider IO, I get decline from plus 14s, that's easy for you to say. Well, I am the guy who started playing BFA as a Retribution Paladin, and then transitioned from Retribution to Elemental. Retribution was not meta in BFA. Elemental wasn't meta in BFA either. Maybe for a few months between BOD and the start of Eternal Palace, but that's it. What am I, dumb? What made me choose to play Red Paladin in the first place? It's a simple answer. The answer is because I enjoyed it, because it was fun. And this is something that works anywhere. Are you playing Dota? Are you playing League of Legends? Are you playing Street Fighter? Are you playing Tekken? Are you playing Counter-Strike? Do you always see everyone playing the same thing over and over because they know that's the meta thing to do or the strongest thing to choose? No, there is plenty of variance, and so there is in this game. We do have an advantage for range DPS. You do have a higher chance of being played, of being used, of being chosen if you go range DPS over melee, but that doesn't mean this should be the only thing or even the primary thing that you are gauging, that you are valuing when choosing what to play. It is perfectly up to your discretion. Maybe you like two different melee specs like Rogue and Warrior, but at the same time you're also enjoying Warlock. So if you enjoy Rogue as much as you enjoy Warlock and you have to come to a decider, you have to come to something to split the vote, then sure, you can opt in for Warlock because you know you are focusing on raiding and that Warlock is going to have a rather safe spot in raiding. That can be a good example on how you apply this range DPS advantage to your choice in what to play, but it shouldn't be the main thing or the only thing. Like, god fucking damn it, I really hate playing balance, but hey, it's meta, I gotta play it, right? That's just gonna make you miserable. Now, at the end of all of this, I would like to point out that even if I am minimizing this difference in preference, in priority between ranged and melee DPS, I do still think that melee DPS need some extra help. I don't think that things like now are the perfect situation. No, I also don't think that every spec should be meta, every spec should be playable, because it's never gonna happen. But, however, there should still be some more balance in both Mythic Plus and raids. Affixes should be tuned a little bit better to not be as bad towards melee. Yes, I do agree with the fact that melee DPS should be tuned a little bit higher in damage, and that also Blizzard should do something related to mandatory raid buffs, mandatory raid debuffs, and whatever other raid utility tool you want to bring, and shake things up a bit to make the decision, to make the filling of the raid roster be a little bit more versatile in favor of melee DPS. This is something I still believe. Even while not thinking that the situation is terrible, it definitely should be improved in the quality of life of melee DPS players. Now with this, we are done. We are done with this rambling about the DPS roles in this game. Let me guys know what made you decide to play a melee DPS spec, and whether or not you knew and whether or not you were aware that you would have gotten, let's say, a harder time being considered for content, at least PvE content, as much as you would have if you otherwise played a range DPS. Thank you guys for watching this video. Be free to subscribe to this channel. It doesn't cost any money. Actually, it's only gonna cost YouTube some money, so please do. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, justice for melee DPS except for survival, because the only survival spec that exists is a ranged one.